It all started with an invitation. Greg, one of my closest friends in middle school, invited me and two others, Jay and Mark, on a week-long trip to Maine. His family had a summer home on one of the small islands in Casco Bay, a place none of us even knew existed until then. Greg's family was always a bit secretive, and this trip felt like a rare glimpse into their private world. The idea of spending a week away from home, exploring a remote island, was thrilling. We were all odd kids in our own ways, but that's what made us inseparable. Little did I know, this trip would change everything. The excitement of the adventure overshadowed the subtle unease I felt about Greg's family. They were strange, to say the least, but I brushed it off. After all, this was our chance to bond and create memories that would last a lifetime, or so I thought. Greg's family was unlike any I had ever met. His dad was an over-the-top germaphobe, constantly sanitizing everything and glaring at me whenever I sneezed. His mom was quiet, almost ghostly, and rarely spoke unless necessary. The house itself felt like a maze, with narrow hallways and rooms that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. It was easy to get lost, both physically and mentally, in that place. The island had a dreamy, otherworldly quality to it. Everyone knew each other, and strangers would greet Greg by name as if he were a local celebrity. But beneath the surface charm, there was something unsettling. The way the locals looked at us, the whispers that stopped when we approached. It all felt off. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fun we were having biking around the island, but the unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The drive to Maine was long and uncomfortable. My runny nose and constant sneezing irritated Greg's dad, who shot me disapproving looks every few minutes. Mark and I bickered over something trivial, adding to the tension. By the time we reached the ferry, I was exhausted. The ferry ride was the highlight of the journey. The cool ocean breeze a welcome relief. But as we approached the island, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were entering a different world. The house was small but charming, nestled among towering trees. It felt isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. That first night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange detachment, as if the island was pulling me into its grasp. I told myself it was just the excitement of the trip, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The island had a surreal, dreamlike quality. The air was crisp, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was constant. We spent our days biking around, exploring every corner of the island. The locals were friendly, but their smiles felt forced, their eyes lingering a little too long. There was an unspoken tension, a secret they weren't sharing. The house itself was a labyrinth, with rooms that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. I often found myself disoriented, unsure of how I had ended up in a particular room. The island's beauty was undeniable, but it was overshadowed by an underlying sense of dread. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fun we were having. But the unease grew with each passing day, like a storm brewing on the horizon. On the second day of the trip, I realized my Barcelona snapback cap was missing. It was one of my most prized possessions, a gift from my dad. I was devastated. Greg suggested I might have left it on the beach, but I was sure I had brought it back. I searched everywhere, but it was nowhere to be found. Greg's dad dismissed my concerns, telling me not to let something small ruin the trip. I tried to brush it off, but the loss lingered in the back of my mind. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, more of my belongings went missing. A pen from my collection, a nail clipper, even a pair of underwear. At first, I thought I was just being careless, but as the pattern continued, I began to suspect something more sinister was at play. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The whispers seemed to be coming from Mark's bed, but I couldn't be sure. I was too scared to say anything, afraid of what I might discover. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, a low, rhythmic murmur that sent chills down my spine. I tried to block it out, telling myself it was just a dream, but the next morning, the memory of the whispers lingered, a dark cloud over the day. I debated asking Mark about it, but something stopped me. I didn't want to know the truth. Not yet. Mark's behavior grew increasingly strange as the trip went on. He would disappear for hours, only to reappear without explanation. His eyes often had a distant, vacant look, as if he were somewhere else entirely. One afternoon, while we were playing in the yard, Mark said he needed to use the bathroom. He was gone for a long time, longer than usual. When I glanced back at the house, I saw him standing in a second-floor window, staring blankly at us. But Greg's house didn't have a second-floor bathroom. I turned to see if anyone else had noticed, but they were all distracted. When I looked back, Mark was gone. The incident left me shaken, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to ruin the trip, but the unease continued to grow, a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The image of Mark standing in the second-floor window haunted me. It didn't make sense. Greg's house didn't have a second floor. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. The window was real, and Mark had been standing there, watching us. The thought sent chills down my spine. I began to notice other strange things. Footprints leading to the house, whispers in the night, the feeling of being watched. The island's dreamy atmosphere had turned into a nightmare. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how to explain my fears to the others. So I stayed, hoping the unease would pass. But it only grew worse. One afternoon, while everyone was out, I decided to snoop through Mark's belongings. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I had to know the truth. What I found shocked me to my core. Hidden in his duffel bag were my missing belongings. My Barcelona cap, my pen, even a pair of my underwear. My heart raced as I dug deeper, uncovering a notebook filled with disturbing drawings. Monsters, acts of violence, and worst of all, drawings of me. One image in particular stood out. A drawing of me on a cross, my legs missing. The final page sent a chill down my spine. My name scribbled over and over, followed by the words, "I'll do it tomorrow." I felt sick to my stomach. Mark wasn't just strange. He was dangerous. The notebook was a window into Mark's twisted mind. The drawings were horrifying. Monsters, mutilated bodies, and scenes of unspeakable violence. But the most disturbing were the drawings of me. One image showed me on a cross, my legs missing. Another depicted me being stabbed repeatedly. The final page was the worst. My name scribbled over and over, followed by the words, "I'll do it tomorrow." I felt a wave of nausea as I realized the extent of Mark's obsession. He wasn't just strange, he was a threat. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confront him, not alone. But I couldn't ignore it either. The notebook was proof of something dark and dangerous, and I had to act before it was too late. The final page of Mark's notebook was the most chilling. My name was scrawled across the top in bold letters, followed by the words, "I'll do it tomorrow." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what it was, but I had a terrible feeling. I showed the notebook to Greg's dad, hoping he would take action, but he dismissed it, telling me to put everything back and not to mention it to anyone. I was furious. How could he ignore something so serious? I tore out one of the pages as proof, determined to get help. But as I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was watching me. His eyes burned into my back, a silent promise of what was to come. The next morning, Greg's dad announced a family emergency and said we had to leave immediately. I could feel Mark's eyes on me as we packed our things, his gaze filled with a mix of anger and something darker. The drive back was tense, with everyone silent and on edge. Greg's dad dropped Mark off first, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as we drove away. But the relief was short-lived. As we pulled away, I glanced back and saw Mark standing in the driveway, staring at us with an expression I'll never forget. It was a look of pure hatred, a promise that this wasn't over. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like I was being hunted. The notebook was proof of Mark's twisted mind, but I didn't know if anyone would believe me. All I could do was wait and hope that the nightmare was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When we got home, I broke down and told my parents everything. They were furious, both at Mark and at Greg's dad for trying to sweep it under the rug. They called the police immediately, and I showed them the page I had torn from Mark's notebook. The police took it seriously, obtaining a warrant to search Mark's house. They found the notebook and returned most of my belongings. But my pen was never recovered. The investigation was a blur, with the police asking endless questions and my parents trying to shield me from the worst of it. Mark's family moved away shortly after, and he never returned to school. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. Years later, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. It was short and to the point. I remember everything. Inside the envelope was my missing pen, the one Mark had stolen all those years ago. My heart raced as I realized what it meant. Mark hadn't forgotten. He had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The letter was a warning, a reminder that he was still out there. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. There was no proof. All I had was the pen and the memory of that terrible trip. I felt trapped, like I was back on the island, surrounded by shadows and whispers. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. My family had a strange tradition. Every winter, we would rent a house in a remote location and spend a week together. It was supposed to be a bonding experience, but for me, it was a source of anxiety. The houses were always isolated, surrounded by woods or mountains, and the nights were long and dark. This year, we rented a cabin in Vermont, a massive, castle-like structure that felt more like a prison than a vacation home. The moment we arrived, I felt a sense of dread. The woods were too quiet, the air too still. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. Something wasn't right. One of our family traditions was a massive game of laser tag in the woods. It was supposed to be fun, but for me, it was a nightmare. The rules were simple. Last person standing wins. As we spread out into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like grasping hands. I tried to focus on the game, but the unease was overwhelming. Then I heard it. A faint clicking sound, like someone was following me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could feel it in my bones. I turned and ran, desperate to escape whatever was out there. As I ran through the woods, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They were fresh, leading deeper into the forest. I followed them, my curiosity outweighing my fear. The footprints led to a thick tree, and as I approached, I saw someone standing behind it. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't one of my family members. It was a stranger, dressed in dark clothing and holding a knife. I turned and ran, the sound of footsteps close behind me. The woods were a blur, the trees closing in around me as I struggled to find my way back to the cabin. I didn't know if I would make it, but I had to try. I burst into the clearing, screaming for help. My uncle Lucien was the first to respond, his hunting rifle in hand. He fired a few shots into the air, and the stranger disappeared into the woods. I collapsed, my legs giving out from under me. The rest of the night was a blur, with the police arriving and searching the woods. They didn't find anything, but the experience left me shaken. The next morning, we discovered a snowman outside the cabin, its hand holding the laser gun my aunt had dropped. It was a chilling reminder that we weren't alone. The strangers were still out there, watching and waiting. The snowman was a message, a warning that we weren't safe. Its hand held the laser gun, a symbol of the game we had played the night before. But it wasn't just a game anymore. The strangers had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The snowman was a reminder that they were still out there, lurking in the shadows. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like I was back on the island, surrounded by danger. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The trip to Vermont was supposed to be a bonding experience, but it turned into a nightmare. The strangers in the woods, the snowman's warning, it all left me shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the danger was still out there. The experience changed me, leaving me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I didn't know if I would ever feel safe again. All I could do was wait and hope that the nightmare was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The strangers were still out there, watching and waiting, and I didn't know when they would strike again.